Hi, I am so thrilled to be talking with Eliot Higgins this morning. Eliot, who, as many of you will know, is the founder and chief executive of Bellingcat, which is the investigative journalism collective responsible for uncovering a really impressive number of global scoops over the last decade. He founded Bellingcat in 2014. Its headquarters is in the Netherlands. They've got 18 employees and more than 30 contributors around the world. Bellingcat is the pioneer of open source journalism, and their forensic research of publicly available data and citizen journalist analysis uses techniques such as geolocation, and satellite imagery to corroborate and disprove claims. Eliot also has a book coming out in the spring of 2021 called We Are Bellingcat, which I am really looking forward to reading.
Thank you, Amelia. Amelia Gentleman is a Guardian journalist. She's best known for her recent work on the Windrush Scandal, which exposed the deportation of people originally from British colonies in the Caribbean or elsewhere in the Commonwealth who legally had a right of residence in the UK. She writes about her multi-award-winning work on the Windrush Scandal in The Windrush Betrayal, exposing the hostile environment, and has previously won awards for her work over the past decade on a range of social issues. First question, a very basic one, I think. Maybe it'd be interesting how you started in journalism.
So I studied history and Russian at university. I wanted to be a journalist. I was involved in student journalism of a not very wonderful variety, but I was quite interested in it. And when I was studying Russian in St. Petersburg, I translated articles there for an English language newspaper. So I had quite a clear idea as a university student that that's what I wanted to do. And then I applied for lots of training programs after I left university, and I didn't get any of them. So I went to City University to do a postgraduate in newspaper journalism, I think it was. And I regret to say that I dropped out after a term, and I took a job with the Press Association where I was a trainee for a couple of years, which was a really, really great job. And I'm thrilled to have started there. What about you, Eliot?
I kind of fell into it accidentally, I think, really. Basically, it was all about winning arguments on the internet with people about what was happening in Libya, because I started, I've always been very interested in kind of world affairs, and I've spent a lot of time online, which meant you have lots of arguments with people online if you're interested in that sort of thing. And in 2011, it was, Libya was the conflict that was happening. And I was kind of discussing stuff on the internet, and there was this debate that's, always happens now with every single subject about whether or not something is true. But this was kind of, I guess, the pre-internet kind of fact-checking era, where you kind of was just relying on the source rather than anything, to do with, the analysis of these stuff. So I found it very frustrating that kind of mainstream news organizations were ignoring these videos that are appearing from places like Libya that seem to show details that weren't being reported in the press. And some of it was kind of very, technical stuff, like what kind of weapons are they using, or, what town have they just captured in this video? And it wasn't being reported on because people didn't trust it. So I came up with this idea that, you could use satellite imagery and compare it to a video and then confirm where something was filmed. And that was almost, to me, just like a kind of little fun game kind of thing. But then more and more people started finding that useful, and I was just posting this stuff online, and journalists started picking up on that. And then I started a blog in 2012, and just really not like as an attempt to become a journalist, but what had happened is my daughter had been born a few months earlier, and I was, based on my hobbies, went out the window. So I thought I'll start something I can pick up and put down really easily. So I started this blog, and then it kind of became my entire life. And then from there, I just kind of got drawn into, the kind of world of journalism and kind of other kinds of worlds as well. But I'd be, I've been listening to a lot about the work you've done on Windrush and kind of the other work you've been doing. What kind of is your main, what do you feel is your main motivating factor when you do your work?
I think something that I think it always helps to focus on something that you find troubling, or that you find kind of problematic, or something that worries you. I think if I'm writing about something that I feel kind of uneasy about, and that's something that I think is wrong, that is quite a powerful motivator. And I'm a tiny bit cautious when I say that, because I'm a news reporter, and I really kind of resile at the categorization as kind of campaigning journalist. And so, really what my job is to report on things and kind of write about things in a fairly neutral way, I guess, on paper. But I suppose the kind of selection of what it is that you write about is the key part of the process. And over the last 10 years, I've been looking mainly at policy. So although I'm kind of not a politics reporter in the sense of being based in Westminster and writing about what happened in Westminster yesterday, I'm usually looking at bits of government policy, looking at how they impact on the people for whom they've been written. And over the last 10 years, there's been quite a lot around welfare reform, around NHS changes, and more recently around kind of changes to Home Office policy that has provided very fertile ground for taking a look at how those policies are feeding out for the people for whom they've been designed, and where the flaws are really. And I think that's why I'm so interested to talk to you today, because actually I think that the way that we work is so incredibly different, and it's really interesting to see kind of two such different ways of approaching journalism, because I think a lot of what I'm doing is around kind of talking to people about what their experiences of kind of often very, very dry and complicated bits of policy are, and trying to explain to readers why they should be engaged in an issue, why they should worry about an issue, but through talking to people. And I do kind of analyze documents in that I have to read a lot, but I'm just absolutely fascinated by the enormous impact that your work has had in, through such a different process. And do you think that's a fair comparison? I mean, you're less involved in talking to individuals.
Yeah, I with Bellingcat, because it kind of developed organically, it was never, I never kind of saw myself as being in a particular kind of area of work, like being just a journalist. And then because we've often been approached by NGOs, people, basically advocating for certain things, or activists asking if we can look at certain things, or our work has kind of moved into that area. We found this idea of kind of collaborating with other people, kind of on passion projects, I guess you could call it, very, very powerful, because we are very good at, what we do, online open source investigation, but we know there's other approaches to, finding out, kind of making the most of our material and combining it with other material. So it's like we've recently been doing a lot of work on the activities of Frontex, doing pushbacks of migrants in the Mediterranean. And that was a combination of, the work of Bellingcat doing the open source investigation, working with forensic architecture, who kind of do these reconstructions of these events, various newspapers, organizations that are focused on migrant pushbacks and stuff like that, and combining all our different kind of areas of expertise, doing the best we can in those areas of expertise, and then turning it into kind of one collection of information, but then being able to have kind of multiple kind of outcomes from that, not just kind of the journalistic sense, but, you know, the advocates can go off and advocate, the policymakers can go and talk to other policymakers, we can publish our articles with all the analysis and all the kind of really in-depth stuff that's actually really useful to the other people, because you're kind of equipping them with the information they need to kind of get out there and, you know, have impact. And that's with the Frontex stuff. I'm really pleased to say that the European Commission has taken this really seriously, and they're currently extremely displeased with Frontex. And there's a lot of pressure now for Frontex to explain exactly what's happening. And Frontex at the moment seems to be doing a very poor job. And it's interesting for me is we've dealt with so much kind of misinformation and propaganda. You know, we do a lot of stuff from Russia, so we're soaring in that kind of stuff. But seeing that kind of behavior being repeated in different areas, like not, you know, it's explicit as Russia would do it, but Frontex kind of just dismissing kind of the videos and stuff because somehow that doesn't count if you've got a video of something happening. But they don't seem to realize.
Can you tell the listeners a bit more about what Frontex is?
So it's basically they're responsible for enforcing kind of the borders basically in Europe, and they've been involved a lot with kind of migrant pushbacks and, you know, patrolling the Mediterranean. And the suspicion is, which appears to be proved by the information we've collected, which includes video footage, is that they're purposely pushing back migrant boats by, you know, they'll sail past them so the waves push them back in. That, you know, these are boats with dead engines and stuff like that, so they're floating in the Mediterranean. So rather than rescuing them as they're meant to be doing, they're basically pushing them back into other territorial waters, so they don't have a responsibility. But this can lead to boats capsizing, people drowning, you know, terrible consequences. Yet it seems that the Europeans' force for protecting our borders, is doing it a little bit too aggressively, basically, and it's resulting in terrible things happening. And they're denying any of this is happening. And we're now in a position where we have evidence that this is something that's actually happening. So it's causing a bit of drama at the European Parliament. But then, you know, you were talking about as a journalist that, you know, you're, the kind of advocacy side of it is not something you want to be kind of known for, is it?
I just think it's a difficult area because obviously it's a very it's very satisfying to look at the bits of policy that have changed as a result of journalism that I've been involved with. And I saw a tiny bit around reporting on some of the flaws in the welfare reform policy that was introduced from kind of 2010 onwards. But actually, that was something that I reported on for years. And the ultimate response of the government was to kind of tweak a few tiny algorithms, I think, and there was minimal response. And although I think it was clear to pretty much everybody who was going through the system, and it was clear to readers that there was something very flawed and unfair in the system, there weren't an enormous amount of changes as a result of highlighting that. And I think that was what was interesting when I was writing more recently about some of the flaws in the way that the Home Office was distinguishing between people who are here legally and people who are here illegally, and the fact that they were so themselves so ill-equipped to actually distinguish between these two groups of people that you think would be easily distinguishable between. It was really gratifying, I suppose, to see the enormous amount of work that they had to do to try to begin to resolve that issue. It remains a bit unresolved, but yeah, I mean, that is a very good outcome as a journalist. But I suppose my hesitation around the notion of being a campaigning journalist is that you ultimately, I think you're kind of writing to inform your readers, and particularly for a newspaper journalist or for a kind of working for The Guardian, you don't want to necessarily become known as a campaigning journalist because it feels like you're going around with a frying pan trying to hit your readers on the head every time you write something. And I think it slightly erodes your your credibility or your neutrality. And so that's why I'm cautious about it, which isn't to say I'm not hugely in awe and admiring of, you know, campaigning journalists throughout history, but I'm not totally sure that that's, yeah, how I would describe myself. I don't know whether that feels a very kind of, you know, semantic distinction.
I understand where you're coming from. I think Bellingcat's in a weird position because the thing with open source information and evidence is that it's available to everyone. We aren't like saying this person's told us something or we've been sent this. It's like, look at this link and look at the thing we found. So I think with the work we did on MH17, where we were kind of showing Russia's involvement with the shoot down, that was all based off public evidence and there was a criminal investigation going on. So it seemed kind of silly not to just share that information with the people who needed it. And because so much of our work is based off that kind of evidence, that it means that we can share it with a range of organizations who can kind of process it in the way that they would process it. Like we did this investigation into a bombing of a mosque in Syria, and it looked like the Americans were involved with it. And it was full of civilians. And the Americans said, well, it wasn't a mosque and it was an Al-Qaeda meeting location and we only killed Al-Qaeda members. But as we looked through the open source evidence, it became very apparent that was completely false. So we kind of were doing the searching for the open source evidence, piecing together this kind of jigsaw of this building before it was bombed to prove it was a mosque. So like literally using videos and photographs of the building, you know, from multiple angles scattered across the internet to reconstruct it and show that internally it was a mosque. And the bit they blew to pieces was a working mosque. And then we worked with Human Rights Watch, who used their kind of skill on the ground and combined with what we were finding to talk to people and build a picture there. And that was reconstructed with forensic architecture. And that the impact of that was the Pentagon having to change their story and say, oh, it was a mosque. It was just like a targeting error, basically. Ignoring the fact that they killed literally dozens of people, like innocent civilians because of this error. And still trying to claim it was Al-Qaeda they were bombing, even though there were children who were being filmed, pulled out the rubble. But it's kind of, we didn't approach that as being like, we want to change something. It was just like, here's something that is untrue and we've got evidence that it is untrue. So we're going to present that to the world and then kind of see what happens. But it kind of comes in at different levels and kind of different angles. Sometimes you really kind of want to push for change. Like with one researcher looking at Scottish limited partnerships. And that's actually very heavily data driven because all the information coming from Companies House, which, you know, is...
I didn't quite hear what's the current research that you're doing?
It's research on something called Scottish limited partnerships. And they're basically companies that are being used for money laundering. And the data is all out there. It's all on Companies House, which, I mean, the government could go and look at it themselves, but they just haven't. And we don't know why, and we think it might just be because it's not like a high priority and it's a bit hard to do. But that's revealed, you know, how heavily these are involved in money laundering, and that information was being used by like Margaret Hodge MP in Parliament to explain to the government what was wrong with their system. And that is kind of taking data that's already out there and then just turn it into something that's actually understandable and usable, and then people can take that and actually have a solid basis for the statements they're making and the claims that they're doing. So, but, you know, that something that also interests me and comes up a lot in our work is kind of the ethical considerations around the work we're doing. So I'm kind of wondering in your own work, you know, with Windrush, when you're kind of talking to ordinary people who kind of start becoming part of a bigger story, what kind of ethical considerations are you making when you're kind of doing your work?
I think I was really, really cautious around the question of how fair or ethical is it to ask people who are in a very, very difficult and vulnerable state to come to be interviewed, to lay out their life stories, to agree to have you know, details of their immigration history and to have a photograph in the newspaper and remain on the internet forever. That every time I do that kind of an interview like that, I find that the kind of most important question to get right, because on the one hand, a lot of this work is about giving a voice to people who have been trying to get their voice heard and who have felt silenced for a long time. So in one way, it's a kind of unquestionable good thing to help them to have space on the internet and in the national newspaper to say exactly what has gone wrong. And on the other hand, it is fraught with worries, because for anybody to see their face on the front page of a newspaper is a very, very kind of stressful experience, and a lot of people were worried about the potential for that exposure to have a negative impact on their further dealings with the Home Office. Luckily, in this case, actually quite the reverse. Pretty much everybody who came to The Guardian to talk about their difficulties with having been misclassified as an illegal immigrant found that it had almost immediate, very, very positive consequences with the Home Office, because there was an immediate sort of damage limitation exercise to try and clear up and get people individually their papers and to try and dampen down the story. But that process of thinking about this kind of balance between wanting to make sure that people's voices are heard and also understand that for some people that might be a very difficult thing to do, and that there may be difficult consequences. I find that ethically complicated. What about you? I mean, I imagine your job must be fraught with ethical concerns, and also maybe you have the same worry that I have going all the way along, is that when you're kind of escalating somebody's concerns, you have to be yourself absolutely certain that you're right and that what they're telling you is right, and that filtering process and that kind of pre-investigation to make sure that there's nothing that you've got wrong is the thing that I think gives me most ulcers in my job, because to highlight a situation and saying that this is a very, very bad thing that's going wrong, you need to be 100% sure, and I imagine that must be problematic also for you.
Yeah, it's I think the way in which kind of journalism has kind of interacted with social media over the past 15 years or so, probably with the introduction of the iPhone and everyone getting on social media and sharing everything, there was kind of a feeling of a free-for-all. You could just take any picture you saw off the internet and use it for what you want. And you see reporting in other unnamed news outlets where social media posts kind of just splattered all over pages for barely any story. It's just some celebrity in their bikini and there's like 800 words on it and that kind of stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So for us, when we're dealing with often quite terrible crimes, we're kind of thinking, how do we protect the victim without kind of undermining the rest of the story? Sometimes we're doing reporting where it's about individuals around kind of the guilty party. Like when we were looking into the 53rd Air Defence Brigade, where the missile launcher that shot down MH17 came from, we knew some of the soldiers in that brigade were part of a convoy, and some of those were in the missile launcher that shot down MH17, and it was extremely likely that they were the ones who fired the missile at MH17. So we had a whole list of names and identities of people from this brigade. And it was very important information for the investigation, the official criminal investigation, and for getting out there to the public, because it kind of proved that this brigade was involved. But when we published that, we censored all the names. And if we used photographs, we censored the faces, because we didn't kind of want those people being targeted, because we couldn't say this specific person was responsible. We were just saying, these are the people who would kind of know who was responsible. When a missile launcher goes missing for 3 days and it's in your brigade, something's up. We also, because we're doing more kind of around child abuse and stuff like that, we're extremely careful, both from the research perspective, that we don't have our researchers going into those parts of the internet where this imagery is. Because when you're doing this kind of work, it's actually quite easy to kind of, reverse image search something that seems a bit innocent, and then you find yourself going down a very dark rabbit hole. So we do everything we can to make sure our researchers are aware of that and not exposing them to that kind of imagery. Of course, with conflict imagery, you have the same issue as well. So it's kind of a very complex issue, but as well, because we're kind of using this as evidence, often for other things as well, we often have the kind of publishable kind of version, and then the version that has all the details that we wouldn't make public. So I think that's the end of our time, unfortunately. I've really enjoyed talking to you. So thank you for kind of talking to me.
I'm so thrilled. I just kind of can't get over the enormous package of scoops that you have been responsible for over the last 10 years, which we've only kind of scratched the surface of. But yeah, no, I'm very much looking forward to reading your book next year, and I hope that our paths cross again.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you.